Then, with a syringe, I took blood from one of my hands, for Satan to drink, and to be initiated. I put the blood in a glass, and moved away a little, to call Satan to come. Then, there was a loud bang. I don't know from what. I drank my blood, and on cue, I, with my head bowed, asked Levithian to descend into hell. Then, Makis, with a changed voice, pretended to be a demon, said to me, "Do you accept to be tortured and fucked by an ancient torturer?" Then I replied that I accept. At that time, he asked me to keep my head bowed, to say the Our Father for debauchery, and to do what the demon who will enter the room tells me. Makis, with a changed voice, said to me, "I am Nova, undress." I immediately undressed. He blindfolded me with a handkerchief, made me bend over on a sofa, beat me with a rubber rod 10 times, scratched me with a sharp object behind the buttock, there is a mark still, and blood started running down my legs. He told me that this event should be done a total of 9 times, and then I would be able to descend into hell. This is only a small excerpt from the testimony of Caterina Regaggi, accused in 1993 of participation in the gang that is still called the Satanists of Pallini. The gang was not only Asimakis Katsoulas, Manos Dimitrokalis, and Dimitra Margeti. Many children, mostly high school students, passed through their classes for a while, but none of them tortured or killed. For the murder of 2 women, which shocked public opinion at the time and gave the newly founded private television an opportunity to cannibalize on gossip like never before, only the first 2 were convicted of murder. For aiding in the murders, the third of the group, Margeti, or otherwise Satan's doll, as the graphic television of the time called her, was convicted. Let's take things from the beginning. Who were the 3 Satanists? When did they meet? And when did they start their activities? Asimakis Katsoulas was born in 1972 and lived in Ganza until the day he was arrested. His neighbours, in publications of the time, said that since 1990 he began to circulate in Pallini, Koropi and Agia Paraskevi. His friends were already residing there. According to what was leaked by the experts who examined him, from the age of 17 onwards, he had already possessed developed mental abilities and an imposing presence, which his former classmates also admitted. He wanted to stand out, they said. He always wanted to be the leader. His parents described him as a quiet child who stayed in long enough to read and rarely spent money. But growing up, his character began to change, becoming more aggressive, and in 1990, he became completely estranged from them. He will say in his testimony, "Since I was in the 3rd grade of high school, my interest in magic began. I was influenced by the lyrics of heavy metal songs that I used to listen to. This interest was still limited to buying records with satanic lyrics and going to concerts of such musical groups. I dressed in shirts with various satanic figures and symbols painted on them. In 1990, about 2 years after I finished high school, I became more seriously interested in magic, and the first book I bought was titled Necronomicon. This book mentions names of demons and ways to summon them, and describes how, when, and what items are needed to summon them. Texts from this book are read in magic ceremonies, and also in this book are mentioned 50 demons, their hierarchy, and the possibilities of each one. Katsoulas then describes the rest of the books he bought: Red Dragon, Practical Magic, and Solomoniki. He makes it clear that he didn't hide it from his parents or his friends, but he explains with a little disappointment that none of his friends agreed to do any of these ceremonies with him. In other words, to summon a demon together, because in all summoning methods, more than one person had to participate. I couldn't achieve anything on my own. So then he went out in search for more willing partners, and he would find them. In December 1991, the 19-year-old Katsoulas began dating the then 15-year-old Dimitra Margeti, who lived very close to his house on the same street. Margeti, before Katsoulas, had a relationship with Dimitrokalis, and in fact, Katsoulas had met him as Dimitri's boyfriend in a bar in Pallini 4 to 5 months previously. However, their collaboration would not begin yet. Katsoulas was in love with Margeti. He confided in her his research with Satanism, and Margeti confided in him that she was reading related books. He will claim that she will propose to him that they do their first ceremony together in his room. He had lied to her that he was already initiated, so it was time to initiate her too. We had spread on the floor a black cloth on which the pentacle had been painted, and at its 5 ends we attached 5 burning black candles. Dimitra was standing naked on the pentacle, and around her were the candles, while I was standing outside the cloth facing her. Then I took in my hands a file that looked like a sword, and after taking the book from Dimitra and reading some parts of it, I put the file to her head and told her that from that moment she was initiated. Then she kissed me and got dressed. Margeti will describe her initiation differently, saying how that night there were a total of 6 people in the venue, and not just these 2. Regarding her relationship with Katsoula, she will say in an interview that I dated Makis by order of a demon, against my will, because I had no intention of dating Makis. Afterwards, Margeti will introduce Katsoulas to Dimitrokalis again, and for the initiation of the latter, they will go to an area of Imitos in Sessi, 5 kilometers away from Goropi. They will be joined by 2 other people, Vasilis and Akis. Dimitrokalis will ask Vasilis to bring a dog with him to kill, to prove that he has guts. As soon as we got there, describes Katsoulas, Manos put the dog on a table, whose legs were tied, and with an axe he had in a bag he was carrying, he cut its throat. Then, from the same bag, he took out a glass beaker and put into it blood that was pouring from the dog's neck. Then he brought the glass to his mouth and drank the blood. On August the 27th, 1992, Katsoulas, Dimitrokalis and Margeti will lead the 14-year-old Dora Siropoulou to a deserted location in Sessi, which we mentioned above, in order to sacrifice her to Lucifer. They had promised her that they would introduce her to Satanism, and more specifically, that they would help her see what is down there. Down there meaning hell. They presented Down Under as a second Earth with fewer problems and more pleasures, and the little girl, already excited by 2 or 3 ceremonies she had taken part in before, would unfortunately trust them. The 3 of them would wait for her outside her tutoring school in Michalokolopoulou. They will put her in the car, and after a short walk in Likabetus, it was early and they had to wait until midnight, only then did they do the ceremonies. They took me with them, so I wouldn't be afraid, Margeti would later say. I couldn't refuse. I was afraid. Dora believed she would be initiated that night, but Manos thought that with a human sacrifice, he would gain strength. I knew it was simply the will of the devil. They will take her to a place specially designed for the ceremony, and from a black bag, Dimitrokalis will take out a file, several candles, a black cloth with a pentacle, and the book Practice of Magic. They had already told Siropoulou that in order for the ceremony to work, she would have to pass out. They strip her naked, handcuff her, make her kneel, and hit her on the head with a stick in order to knock her unconscious. All true to the ritual. Despite the 2 blows to the head, she did not faint. She stood up and began to stumble, crying, "Why are you doing this to my children?" She will be told to be quiet, and after the handcuffs were removed, she will be instructed to put her hands behind her head and kneel. Now, she must take 10 deep breaths and hold her breath on the 10th, so that Dimitrokalis grabs her by the head and faints. That won't work either. Finally, they tell her to lie down and they start holding her nose and mouth until she loses consciousness. A minute later, she began to cry and shake, so they let her go again. Katsoulas will leave and head to the car where Marietti was waiting for them. After 10 minutes, the two of them will see a fire and Dimitrokalis running with jewellery and a wristwatch in his hands. Running to escape the fire, they almost crashed into a truck, and a few minutes later on Lavriou Avenue, Dimitrokalis will admit that he drowned a 14-year-old girl and that he poured gasoline on her in order to dispose of the body. It was obvious to the court that Katsoulas wanted to blame Dimitrokalis. The most likely version remains that they killed her together and then that they abused the little girl's corpse. Dimitra Marietti will reveal in her interview to the Free Press, "The day before Siropoulou, Katsoulas was not well. I asked him what was wrong. He told me that some demon wanted a certain woman because he liked her. And he said that we should take her to Ceci, and then the girl would just disappear. The demon would take her. I didn't know about murder," Marietti said. "Makis had said one thing to her and another to me. I felt cheated, but I couldn't react. If I spoke, I would be dead too." The second Satanist strike will take place a year later, on April the 14th, 1993. It is Holy Wednesday, and Marietti will say that they chose this day on purpose, as they knew that if they killed on Holy Week, they would get more power from the spirits. However, she herself will not participate. This time, it will be the case of only Katsoulas and Dimitrokalis. That night, on Manafan Avenue, near a bus stop, they will meet the 28-year-old Garifalia Yurga, who was returning home after work. She was working as a maid in the Great Britain Hotel. The two of them, under the pretense of being policemen, will convince her to get into their car. In fact, Dimitrokalis had also shown her a fake police ID that his friend, Babis Zavaras, had made on his behalf with a computer. They explained to her that they will take her to the nearest police station for a background check, but instead, they will take her to the abandoned Camber factory. There, they will assault her, and after getting her naked into the car, they will take her back to Ceci. They will take her personal belongings, among which was a bag with half a lamb in it, an Easter gift from her company. There, they will strangle her and then mash her head so that she cannot be recognized. Dimitrokalis described in his testimony, "When we left Koropi, Garifalia began to worry and showed that she no longer believed that we were police officers and began to beg us not to harm her. Then Makis started telling her that we were not police officers and that her husband had us follow her. She told us not to say anything to her husband and that she would give us more money than him. Makis told me to take a stone and hit her on the head because she wouldn't die. I told him that it was impossible for me to do such a thing. Then he, because Garifalia continued to make muffled sounds, took a large stone from nearby, and as Garifalia was on her back, he began to beat her on the head furiously, several times holding the stone with both hands. Garifalia had a few convulsions and then stiffened. Katsoulas describes her murder differently, and apparently blamed it on his ex-best friend. According to him, they persuaded her to follow them, telling her that where she was sitting and waiting, drugs were being trafficked. Under the pretense that she looked suspicious, that she might be selling them herself, they put her in a car, and at the Camber factory, they took her down to search her. Manos pulled her pants and panties down to her knees and lifted her top over her breasts and pushed her breasts out of her bra. He had told her not to be afraid and that he would simply be doing a physical check on her. Katsoulas continued in his testimony, saying that they then put her naked in the car, handcuffed her, and that they later stopped on a deserted road. Dimitrokalis told Katsoula that he was going to talk to some ancients, meaning demons, and when he returned, he told him that he had their consent to kill her. They suffocated her in the car. Dimitrokalis grabbed her neck and Katsoulas her legs, so they wouldn't hit the windshield. They then threw her on the ground and crushed her head with a large stone. We burned her clothes, shoes, bag and identity card the same night in the fireplace of Manos's house. We threw her jewellery, our handcuffs and our fake pistol into the sewers in Ayabarskivi the next day. It was Holy Wednesday. I had not been told not to leave my house at all and that they would go out in case they might find a girlfriend, said Dimitra Marghetti on a TV show in 1994. I was waiting for a phone call, but it was getting late and I fell asleep. At around 2 or 3 in the morning, Makis told me in a drained voice, I don't know if it was from fatigue or crying, and he told me what had happened. They had found a girl, blonde, tall, with a nice body, with long hair, at the end of Stavros Bridge in Pallini, with fake police IDs made by Makis, and told to follow them. First they took her to some place and then to Gropi. They told me they smashed her head in. On the eve of Christmas 1993, a priest will randomly find himself in the house of Manos Dimitrokalis. The killer will ask to confess. He will break, and it will be the first time he talks about his crimes to someone outside of his gang. So at least he will claim in front of the investigators. While I was on the lookout, I was thinking that everything we were doing was wrong, and I got sick to my stomach. When I returned home on Christmas Eve, there was a priest to who I confessed. The next day, I went to the police and told them what I knew. I couldn't take it anymore, and on Saturday, the day of my feast day, I received communion. Apparently, the priest, who also performed a blessing that day, was not at the family's house by chance. In an interview, his parents will say that they had approached him in order to help their child. They knew their son had been involved in this story for 2 years, but his threats to kill himself if he revealed the slightest thing tied their hands. He eventually went to the police himself. He came home in the morning and woke me up. Father, I told everything to the police. Don't be afraid for me now. I have been redeemed. We didn't know about all these horrible things that they accused him of. If I thought my child was doing all this sober, I, as his father, would either kill him with my bare hands or take him to the police myself. Manolis, however, acted as if he was on drugs. He was under the orders of this man, Makis as he is called. The next day, he will be called back to security officers, where his father will drive him in his car. He will wait for him outside the department for about 3 hours, but in vain. Dimitrokalis will not appear. The police told me that it's nothing serious, and we don't need to hire a lawyer, because he had come forward of his own free will, the father would later say to reporters. Many publications of the time reported that Katsoulas had asked Dimitrokalis to sacrifice the latter's 24-year-old sister as well. That was supposed to be the reason he told everything to the police. However, this was never confirmed. Rather, it was one of dozens of rumors recorded as news in the newspapers of the time. The 3 of them will be arrested, and on New Year's Eve, after the end of the preliminary examination, criminal charges will be brought against them by the public prosecutor. They will be taken to the office of the 19th investigator for their statement, and when the case slowly begins to unfold, a series of their friends and acquaintances will also pass through the investigator's office. Criminal prosecution will also be brought against Charalambos Zavras, Angeliki Anagnostou, Varvara Angelopoulou, and Maria and Katerina Rigaki. On January 28, 1994, the reenactment of the 2 crimes will take place. Television and newspapers will be raging all this time. The time he was arrested, Katsoulas was serving his term in the Navy and Dimitrokalis in the Army. On December 30th, 1993, an underground crypt was discovered in the area of Payana, in which it is believed that Satanists performed some of their ceremonies. Among the finds were some wax figures of people with photographs pinned on them, either normal or cut from newspapers and magazines. In fact, according to the police, next to a wedding photo were the bride's head, where there was a note written in pencil which said, "Don't enjoy your happiness." Among these wax effigies was found one of Panayotis Giannakis, then a basketball player of Panioni, with him declaring at the time, "I do not know what to say. It seems incredible to me. A bad joke. Well, a joke. I have nothing to do with all this. No discussion. I've been playing basketball for so many years, and I'm not even proactive, like many people in sports are used to. How can I imagine that 24 hours later there would be my name and my photo on a wax figure? It seems incredible to me. A pity. These new kids are out with all the power of my voice. I call the children, the world to engage in sports, and to forget about ceremonies and magic, for their lives to acquire real meaning." In the afternoon, with another statement, he will add, "Of course I don't think it can affect my family to any extent. These stories are just for laughs." The then Metropolitan of Mesoiu, accompanied by 5 priests, will perform an exorcism of all kinds in the cave of Paena, with dozens of residents present. On June the 23rd, 1995, their trial will begin in the Mixed Jury Court of Athens, with the details of the case monopolizing the world's interest. After 16 days of hearing on July the 1st, the criminal court will put an end to the horror. The court declares the accused Asimaki Katsoula, Manos Dimitrokalli, Dimitra Margieti, Katerina Maria Regaki, and Varvara Angelopoulou guilty. He declares Charalambos Zavras and Angeliki Anagnostou innocent, said the president Efprachia Bayaromoglu. Dimitra Margieti burst into tears. Flashes flash, and she herself shouts to the photographers, "I beg you, stop!" Katsoulas shakes Zavra's hand and says, "Congratulations, man." The prosecutor proposes sentences, and the court retires for a conference. At 2 p.m, judges and jurors return to their seats. Katsoulas and Dimitrokallis were sentenced to 2 life sentences without any mitigating factor, and Margieti to 18 years and 4 months, with a mitigating factor of post-adolescent age being recognized. The mother of Dimitrokallis burst into tears and fainted. Dimitrokallis' lawyer, the well-known Konstantinos Plevris, will argue that his client should have been acquitted. Katsoulas repeats to the journalists that he has nothing to do with Siropoulou's murder, and Margieti's mother falls into the arms of the lawyer Alexis Kouya and bursts into tears. There is a second degree, he tells her. For her part, the mother of the first victim shouts that Margieti should also be sentenced to life. Katsoula's parents were sitting a little closer, unconsolable, with the father telling the journalists, "All my life, I will be my child's side. I have made a promise to God to get him out of jail. The real culprits are those outside. I will look to find the moral perpetrators. Why can't my child hope? He's still only 20 years old." On December the 8th, 1997, the Mixed Court of Appeal of Athens met in the courtroom of Korivalos prisons with Katsoula, Dimitrokallis and Margietis, aiming to reduce their sentence imposed by the first instance body. On December the 24th, the Athens Mixed Court of Appeal will unanimously decide the guilt of the defendants, validating their first trial sentence in accordance with the prosecutor's proposal. They will make a third appeal on January 17th, and it will also be rejected. In November 2001, Dimitra Margieti was released from prison after 8 years in the women's prison of Korivalos. In 2005, she married a construction contractor, and together they had 2 children. In June 2015, she filed an injunction against her estranged husband for child support. In March 2013, Manos Dimitrokallis was released from prison, and for some time it was known that he was working as a programmer in a private company. He had done relevant studies while being behind bars. In December 2016, Katsoulas was also released from the prisons of Aia, where he was held at the will of the Appeals Council of Crete. Over the years, he had made more than 10 applications for parole, all of which had been rejected. A few days later, photos of him were released, showing him overweight and with white hair in his father's house in Pallini.